Look, there you are, Bwlchwernen over there.
Is that it?
Well, that's, Llando'i Brefi.
Okay.
Go over, and then you can see another ridge, and I reckon you just be on there.
Yeah.
All right.
Also, just to say that mountain range, I mean, you'll know this, it's a massive area of wilderness, bigger than Dartmoor. I mean, it's really huge, and no one even hardly knows about it, which is so lovely, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's it. The best kept secret.
We're good to go from my...
Are we rolling?
Mm-hmm. And action.
Okay, hello and welcome to Holden Dairy Farm. I'm Jake from UK Youth for Nature, joined by Patrick Holden at his very farm, the founding director of the Sustainable Food Trust. Patrick, thanks for having us. It's been a crazy weekend. We've learnt so much. I'm going to go straight to the big hitters, if that's okay. So, the hidden cost of food, we talked a little bit about this yesterday. We know that food's getting more expensive, but in reality, the price we pay at the supermarket isn't the full story. And you wrote about this in your recent report, The Hidden Cost of UK Food. So can you give us an overview of that and what some of the hidden costs of food are?
Yes, I'll have a go. I mean, just to say, it's been wonderful having you. We've loved it.
Thanks so much.
So, yeah. We did publish this report, The Hidden Costs of UK Food. Actually, a few years ago now, it was kind of refreshed in 2019. And then our headline was, if you go to a supermarket and you buy £1 worth of food, that's not the real price. It's probably at least double that. So if you paid for all the hidden costs, the damage to climate, the destruction of natural capital, the damage to public health through poor quality food, and added up all those costs, which are hidden from us and paid in ways which we possibly didn't realise, like through higher National Health Service treatment costs, or cleaning up the pollution from water, or taking pesticides out of the water, etc. The price should be £2 or maybe even £3. So we think we are buying cheap food, but actually it's not cheap at all. But because governments think, probably rightly, that everyone who votes them in wants cheap food, if they made the polluter pay, which is basically what would need to happen to sort this out, and they redirected the subsidies so that farmers like us get payments for contributing towards avoiding climate change or rebuilding biodiversity or improving public health through more nutrient-dense food, then that would put the average price of food up, and you wouldn't like that.
Yeah, well, that's it. So ironically, the cheapest food often comes with the most environmental cost. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, for farmers, the wrong thing pays and the right thing doesn't. So all our neighbours, no fault of their own, they are going more intensive. Some of the dairy farmers around here, they're causing pollution, and I'm not saying they're environmental vandals or anything like that. They're just following the money. And so what we need is to change the signals so that farming systems like this pay better than the other ones. And to do that, we need a large number of people to understand these issues. And that's why it's been so great having you here.
Yeah, okay. So yesterday we kind of touched on consumer action. So us as young people, what advice would you give to us as consumers who want to support sustainable farming through our choices at the supermarket?
Well, I think you are kind of an advanced focus group, if you see what I mean, because you have been here for a couple of days. I think you probably learned some things you didn't know before. But really what we need to do is to scale that, because if enough people realise that farming systems like this are good, good for health, good for nature, good for climate, and the other sort of farming systems are bad, you might then think this is important in two ways. First of all, the kind of food you will buy in the future, but also when it comes to voting in the next government, you might think, well, this is an electoral issue. I will say to Sir Keir Starmer, whoever it is, what are you doing about farming, making it more organic, regenerative, nature-friendly, etc.? And if you don't have a manifesto which has that in it, I'm not going to vote for you. And at the moment, that's not true. And if you think about the Prime Minister or Rachel Reeves, and you ask them, are the sort of issues we've been discussing the last couple of days a voting issue, they'll say no. And they're probably right.
And do we have power as a consumer through the choices we make?
Yeah, you have enormous power. If you think about it, individual citizens scaled are more powerful than the world's biggest food company. So if we go into a supermarket or wherever we shop, we say to the customer service desk, I want local food with a good story behind it, sustainably produced, all the sort of things that we've been discussing. And they probably won't have it because they don't at the moment. If enough of us, you, do that and say, well, I'll take my custom elsewhere if you don't supply me with the food I want, that will quite quickly come to the attention of the board because they're not stupid supermarkets. They give us what we want. And at the moment, the signals they're getting is we actually want cheap food.
Yeah.
So I think if we change and we can scale the change, which is why we're doing what we're doing here, let's say we could get 100,000 young people, children, but also people who are influencers, and you're very much influencers, to understand all this and then change their buying habits and maybe even their voting habits accordingly, that will bring about change.
Yeah. Should we be shopping at supermarkets, or should we be trying to buy more locally?
I think that's up to each of us. I mean, I shop in supermarkets because they're convenient, not always. But obviously, if you want to buy food with a better story, more sustainable, say a box scheme, Riverford, something like that, or you want milk and dairy products that come from a farm like this, it will be very hard to find them in supermarkets, although there are some organic products in supermarkets. So you can do what you can within the existing system. But if enough of us, as I just said, say we want you to stock these products or we won't shop here anymore, they will change. And I think that in a way behind that question is what kind of system should be the future that we want to step into? You know, is it a system of much more local production rather than centralized everything, which is what we've got at the moment, which is why it's so hard to find good food in the supermarket? And how can we bring about that change towards more regional, more local food from proper sustainable systems? And in a way, what we're doing here on a sort of microcosm level is we are walking that talk. So we're producing carrots for world schools, we're producing cheese, which is unfortunately too expensive for most people to afford, but there's a whole discussion about that, but it is good cheese.
It's delicious cheese.
And we're producing meat, also with a good welfare story behind it, but again, it's not on supermarket shelves. So I think we need to co-design the food future that we need to kind of step into.
And what about buying meat, which is perhaps a controversial topic? Is there a way to do that sustainably?
Yeah, I think there is. And we're just about to produce a report on the role of grazing livestock in sustainable food systems. And if you ask, well, maybe everyone here, before you came, a focus group of young people, do you eat meat? A lot of young people would say, well, I would eat meat if I knew there was a good story behind it, but I'm increasingly worried that there isn't. And then if you ask them, what's the worst kind of meat you could eat, or livestock products, they'd almost certainly say from cows. And yet what our report is going to say is that actually it isn't the cow, it's the how, if you see what I mean. In other words, if the cows such as ours are grazed holistically and they eat mainly a grass diet, not grain, which we could eat, and really they're not designed to eat, and they are part of a system which involves fertility building through a herbal ley, which is like a mixture of grass and clove and herbs over, say, 3 to 5 years to build the fertility. And then you look at the carbon footprint of that whole farm. Actually, a farm like this can be actually carbon negative. In other words, it's sequestering more carbon than it's emitting. And a lot of people would be really surprised at that. So they might say, well, hang on a minute, cows emit methane, which is true. But then we think about it, the methane that the cows emit is part of an ancient cycle which goes back as long as there have been ruminant animals on Earth. And they actually, in that interaction with grass, have built some of the most fertile soils on planet Earth. So what we're trying to do here is mimic that system. And if we did that at scale, tractor starting, if we did that at scale, it's entirely possible that the farms of the future could actually get us out of the trouble we're in with CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. Because although the cows will continue to emit methane, the calculation which has been used by the FAO and all the scientific community, including the Climate Change Committee, has actually overcalculated the impact of the emission. But even if you take the current system, the carbon sequestration in the soil using a farming system like we use more than offsets the methane emissions of the animals. So it's like a net positive.
Yeah.
So you need to think about the methane and then you balance it with the soil carbon and then you've got the true story. People don't know that. In fact, I'd say most people think the opposite of what I've just said.
Yeah. So I work with livestock farmers in Wales and
Bwlchwernen. Yeah, and over there.
Just over there.
Yeah, which is kind of on fire at the moment, isn't it?
It's out now, but it was on fire.
It was on fire.
But I'm reliant on livestock grazing, and I can see how a kind of well-managed grazing system can benefit nature. But like you say, livestock farming does get a lot of criticism from young people, particularly perhaps.
Yeah, and that. Look, I mean, it should be said, if young people are anxious about a bad story behind the meat that they eat, they're right. So it's not about they are wrong, but it's a question of what can we do about it to make it a better story.
So there's a stark contrast between industrial farms, right, and a local farm with a high welfare livestock system.
Yeah.
Can you explain to us kind of the ecological importance of grazing livestock, which you've kind of touched on, but why it's important to distinguish between those intensive farms and the perhaps more regenerative or sustainable systems?
Yeah. Well, just if you give the example of dairy farms, it's a rather depressing statistic. Now, more than half the milk that is sold in UK supermarkets come from cows that never get out to grass. They're euphemistically called fully housed in the dairy press, which means basically they're just it's like factory-style farming, really. And again, I'm not blaming the farmers. They're just swallowing the money.
Sure.
But those cows, which are probably fed silage, but also quite a lot of grain and concentrate feed, are without question part of the problem. And increasingly, the milk and the dairy products that are in the supermarkets come from systems like those, and they're getting bigger and bigger each year. Those systems use nitrogen fertilizer to grow the grass. And when you use nitrogen, which is used everywhere in UK agriculture, you suppress the biology of the soil, but also you make it a very competitive environment for plants. And the only plants which can really thrive on nitrogen are grasses, particularly ryegrasses. So if you look across Wales now, much of it is the grassland of which is fertilized every year. You see a kind of green desert, and that's because of nitrogen fertilizer. So that's half the problem. We need to wean ourselves off chemicals, nitrogen in particular, but also Roundup, which is a spray which kills all green plants, which more and more farmers are using around here. They say, we'll spray off for pasture, for reseeding, or for maybe growing a grain crop. That means spray it off with glyphosate, which is pretty bad. So that is definitely part of the problem. But if you graze the way we do, which is called mob grazing, holistic grazing, adaptive, multi-paddock grazing, all this jargon, sorry about that.
Yeah.
But basically, you graze the cows and move on, maybe from 12 to 48 hours, max 48 hours, and then you're on a different pasture. If you graze like that, not only would get more productivity and more carbon in the soil, but you also get, without nitrogen, you'll get lots of other plants which coexist with that system. Like we're having a dandelion summer at the moment, and you see dandelions all over the farm, or a whole myriad of other plants that we haven't sown, but which can thrive in that ecosystem. And I'm sure what you're doing at Bwlchwernen is related to that, isn't it? It's like using cattle who graze more in a friendly way than, say, sheep, to improve the biodiversity of the land you're managing.
Yeah, correct. The Sustainable Food Trust makes a difference between, or a distinction between, beef and lamb products to pork and chicken products, say. Can you talk us through that difference?
Yeah, so let's imagine a sustainably farmed UK. Interestingly, 2/3 of all the agricultural land in the UK today is grass. But a lot of it is like either in Wales, which is permanent grass, a lot of it's permanent grass, or in the east of England, which is a lot of it's permanent arable. Now, if you imagine a sustainably farmed UK, there might be, interestingly enough, a bit more vegetable cropping and arable cropping, grains, wheat. There are a lot of mills in Ceredigion, and they're mostly, they've gone silent now, but actually this used to be a county of mixed farming. Whereas in the arable East, it's just been monoculture, crop every year for about 70 years, ever since the Second World War. Well, if you scale the sort of farming system we're doing here, you'll have a crop rotation which includes grass to build fertility, and then you will have a a phase of cropping where you run down the fertility, which is what we're doing here with our carrot crops for schools in Ceredigion and Carmarthenshire, but that would be scaled right across the UK. You would have a dramatic change in the way we feed ourselves, and that would have massive positive benefits for wildlife, for climate, and for the nutrient density of the food we eat. And of course, critics of that system will say, we'll never feed the world. But we've done a calculation on that, and another report we produced called Feeding Britain from the Ground Up, where we calculated the impact of a national transition to sustainable farming on the amount of food we produce. And also, if you were to ask, if I wanted to eat a diet which is related to the productivity of that farming system, what would it look like? We could tell you that. And actually, it's pretty interesting, and it relates right back to the question that you asked about pork and poultry. So, do I love pork and poultry? Yes, I do. But those animals can derive a max 25% of their diet from grass. Surprising how much grass chickens can eat, actually, if you watch them. But 75% of their diet has to come from either arable products or waste products from arable systems. So in a sustainably farmed Britain scenario, which is actually, interestingly enough, I can remember what that was like because I'm old enough to remember the 1950s when I was growing up. We used to have chicken as a treat once a month. It was super expensive. It was like an organic pasture-fed chicken is today, maybe 4 or 5 times the price of a sort of Tesco bumper on the bottom chicken. That would be the kind of chicken we would be able to eat in the future farming system. And it would be the same with pork. Pigs used to be fed swill, which is basically carefully processed household vegetable waste, etc. And that was, I think, a very ecological way of producing pork. But we need to think not about feeding pigs and chickens food that we could eat, because we need to make the most of the arable crops. We need to make sure that the pork and the poultry are fed food that we can't eat, and that will be more expensive. So that is a big change, isn't it? Because most people, again, back to the original question, what do they think? What do people think is the least worst meat to eat? They'd all say chicken. Whereas in fact, if you consider the footprint of the grain that the intensive poultry are fed on everything, climate, nature, public health, it's really bad.
So to go back to what you were saying before, I mean, I work with hill farmers who are sheep farmers. They might say that these methods that you're talking about aren't efficient enough to feed everyone. So can you talk to us about that report, Feeding Britain from the Ground Up, what some of the findings were, and what might you say to these livestock farmers?
Well, I think Feeding Britain from the Ground Up is a fantastic message for livestock farmers, especially sheep farmers, beef farmers and dairy farmers. Because what we're saying is if you farm in the right way, your systems are actually part of the solution. And we can make a powerful case to people who may be considering giving up eating meat or dairy products, that actually, if you eat the right kind of meat and you know the difference and you can tell the difference on the supermarket shelf with a labelling system, you can feel that your production system, and they can feel, more importantly, is part of the solution, not part of the problem. So I think we've got a brilliant message for sheep farmers and beef farmers in Wales. And it's sad that the leadership of the farmers' unions is so in love with these massive, intensive, chemically based systems that they tend to be the people who have got the policy advocacy with government, which is, the wrong way around, actually. The people who are family farms, medium and small family farms in Wales, those are the backbone of our rural culture here. We've got a great message for them.
So I work, like I say, yeah.
It's about to, Joe's got the map up and it is about to absolutely. Yeah, we
It's
don't.
Excellent.
Is it? Okay. We're going to go inside.
Yeah, all good.
Okay, slight interval. We are now inside because we are in Wales and it started to rain.
Yeah, that's true. Although, it has to be said, come on, we've had 6 weeks without any rain.
I know, yeah, we're due a bit of rain. So going back to what we were saying, on farmer support, so I work with sheep farmers who are, these are small family-run businesses who feel, they might say that they're heavily reliant on subsidies and often feel that they have no choice other than to prioritise kind of short-term efficiency.
Yeah, and they're right.
Of course.
It's hard at the moment. It's hard to make any money in farming.
It's impossible, yeah.
Yeah.
What advice would you give them if they were looking to adopt more sustainable or regenerative methods, and what advantages might there be in it for them, both ecologically but also economically as well?
Well, I think the first thing to say is I feel a lot of empathy with them, because small and medium-sized family farms are really finding it hard at the moment, especially in livestock, although the prices are good at the moment. But even so, it's hard to make any money on small-scale livestock farming. And I think, ironically, the way in which the large farms, the quote successful ones, have further intensified and got even bigger, is making it more difficult for the small farms. Because if the supermarkets, who are all trying to buy on price, say they're buying milk, if you've got a 500 cow herd, or even in some cases in Carmarthenshire, there's 2,000 cow herds now, and you're trying to buy the cheapest possible milk, and you're a dairy farmer with, say, less than 100 cows like us, the price is going to go down to the point where you're producing milk at less than the cost of production, and you're going to quietly give up. And that was what has happened. I mean, we've been here 52 years. And when we started here in 1973, there were 3,000 small dairy farmers supplying the local milk marketing creamery, as it then was, in Wellenbach, which is just 8 miles from here. Now there's only a handful of us left, and hardly any small family farms, because you just can't make it. And that's really serious. So I think it's difficult because the big politically persuasive voices are of those large successful dairy farms. So the Welsh government comes along and says, we want to make the whole of Wales an NVZ, a nitrate vulnerable zone. And they go, no, we don't want that, because they're putting on so much nitrogen fertilizer and buying in so much animal feed that the land just can't take the burden of all that nitrate, and it's going into the rivers, and it's just part of a big problem causing climate change and everything. But they're the people who are lobbying the Welsh government not to do that, or getting what they call derogations, which is like exemptions for a few years so that they can find a way of adapting. And that's really bad news. And I think the farming community are being led by the wrong kind of voice. And people like me come along, and for a long time I've been challenging the orthodoxy. But look at me, I'm a kind of, well, a superannuated hippie, or whatever you want to call me. I'm probably not a person, even though I think there's a respect for the farming system that we're operating here, that they would necessarily want to follow. And I think there's a big issue about leadership here. And in the end, I think probably the leadership's got to come from citizens who eat food, which is everyone, and who use their citizen power to bring about change. And I would want to say something about that, which is, I think it's really easy in the world in which we find ourselves today to feel quite depressed, because there's obviously climate change, which is an issue, and you feel they need to do something. And as we now know, in a sort of post-Trump world, they are not doing enough. So that's pretty bad. And we think, what can we do? Oh, I'll take a holiday and fly to somewhere or other to escape from it all. And then you look at nature, and the State of Nature reports is chronicling the catastrophic decline of biodiversity. You think, what can I do about that? Not much. And then you think of health, and what do I eat, and can I use my buying power? It's possible to think, God, I don't think we can do anything. But I think what we know from our farming experience here is that it is possible to design and operate a farming system which is part of the solution, not part of the problem. And if you are a person who lives in a city and cares about the environment, we can do something, starting with our power as individual citizens, to be part of the change that's needed. So weirdly enough, I feel quite optimistic about that, because I feel there is hope. And I think there's a way in which we can collectively act to bring about a better future.
That's really promising to hear. So going back to what you were saying about farming change, in my experience, kind of change can be contagious, and farmers follow farmers.
Yeah.
The Sustainable Food Trust have developed the Beacons Farms network. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. We have, over the years, obviously, we've been holding various events, but about 7 or 8 years ago now, we thought, why not turn this barn, which is an old threshing barn where the corn used to be threshed, a part of the old farming system, which is probably not unlike, in some respects, what we're doing now. But we thought, why not turn this into a place where people could come as part of a kind of farm education network. So we thought we had this idea that if we had farms all over the UK and actually all over the world, which were educational platforms, which would give all the people who came to them seeing is believing experiences, which in my case, as a Londoner, changed my life because my mum took me into a cowshed when I was 5, and I thought I'd like to do that one day. And it turns out I came here, and by the 22, I was doing it. We could replicate that with hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people having that experience. Then that would be a change agent. So last year we launched this Beacon Farms network here, and we had a big event. About 150 people came for the weekend. And the qualification for becoming a beacon farm is three components. The first, sustainable farming practice, not necessarily organic, but moving from a chemical to a biological approach. And so a story which you would see on the farm, which you'd relate to and say, okay, this is a future I'd like to step into. Secondly, facilities to host visitors, like this threshing barn, which has got underfloor heating with an air source heat pump, and it's a nice environment, blah, blah, blah. We've got a kitchen here, and now we're developing some accommodation as well. And thirdly, storytelling, because obviously farms and farmers might have brilliant stories, but very often if you're a farmer, you don't even realize the story that you're sitting on the top of. So if we share our storytelling and find out how we can work together, collaborate, we can be more than the sum of our parts. And if you look at this farm, just over the last 2.5 years, we've had about 40 events. And it's amazing how many people have been here and been influenced.
So similar to you, Patrick, I come from London and I knew nothing about...
Where do you come from in London?
East London.
Where?
A little bit all over the place, but let's go with Hackney.
Hackney. Love
What
it.
about you?
East Dulwich.
Okay.
Sort of Peckham area.
Okay.
Peckham
Okay,
borders. And Hadley Wood.
Okay. Very
North
nice.
London.
Very nice. So I knew nothing about farming until a couple of years ago, and it's been completely awe-inspiring and eye-opening working with run-of-the-mill Welsh farmers.
Yeah.
So why is it important to you that young people understand where their food comes from? And can you talk to us a little bit about the Harmony project?
Yeah. Why is it important where your food comes from? Because food is probably the most important determinant of physical health, the quality of the food we eat, and its safety, but also its positive quality. There can be no more important influence than that, the food that we eat. And I think a lot of people know that at some deep intuitive level, but it's very hard at the moment to navigate through all this complex labeling system and cheap food and all the rest of it, and know how to find a way through that. So that's the first thing. Sorry, I'm going to have to ask you what your question was again.
The Harmony project.
No, there was two-part question.
Why is it important that young people understand where their food comes from?
Okay, so maybe I ought to do that again. I think that children going through primary schools today, particularly in the curriculum, there's not a lot of guidance as to how to learn the story behind your food, or indeed cookery, which used to be part of the curriculum. Then it's called domestic science, which is quite weird, really. Why would you call it domestic science? Why not just call it cookery? And so it's really important that we find a way to change the curriculum if necessary, but even within the existing curriculum, make sure that children have a chance to visit a farm and learn the story behind their food. And can I talk a bit about the Welsh Veg in Schools project?
Yeah.
So we grew carrots for many years. They were sold in the supermarkets. They were sold in just about all the supermarkets, actually. But gradually, due to the policy that all the supermarkets have now of only having one packing operation or slaughterhouse or meat packing plant or distribution centre, they moved all the distribution points further, mostly to the eastern counties. And in the case of carrots, there's a carrot packer called Produce World near Peterborough, and they were like the last carrot packing station standing. And although when we first started growing carrots for Sainsbury's in 1985, and believe it or not, the first organic vegetables Sainsbury's ever sold were grown here and packed in our cowshed with a sort of system that would never be allowed today. they gradually closed down all those packing stations until there was just the Peterborough station. So we tried to grow carrots here, take them all the way to Peterborough, which is 235 miles away. Couldn't make it work, gave up growing carrots. But then last year, some people called what's it called? Sense About Food. Oh, anyway, it's just so. Can you cut into this? Is it okay? So basically, last year, a consortium of growers, a big food distribution company called Castell Howell, and the Welsh government, and an NGO which had set up and was advocating all this, came to us and said, "Would you grow carrots again?" So I said, unsurprisingly, "What's the price? How can you make it work?" So they said, "We'll give you a guaranteed price for the carrots. We will collect them from the farm. We will make sure they're washed and packed and distributed to schools in Carmarthenshire, which is our adjacent county." And we said, "Okay, we'll do that." So we grew an acre of carrots, and it was a great success. We had about 12 tons off an acre of carrots, and they went into Carmarthenshire schools. And the really interesting thing is that last September, the local primary school, which is called Ysgol, which is where all our kids went, they said, "Can we come and see your carrot field?" And this was year 3 and 4 with the head teacher and the class teacher. They came one afternoon, it was a beautiful sunny afternoon. We took all of them into the carrot field. And I said, "Would you like to top the carrots and put them in?" They all joined in. And then they went back to their school. And Ceredigion were not part of this Welsh Veg in Schools project. So they decided that they would protest. So they launched a campaign to get our county, Ceredigion, included in the Welsh Veg in Schools project. And guess what? It was successful. So now Ceredigion is in this Welsh Veg in Schools project, and it was so successful in our county that actually the amount of carrots that went to Ceredigion was greater than Carmarthenshire, which is an amazing story of pupil power to be the change. And I think the reason why that was the case is because A, they'd had this amazing experience in the carrot field on a wonderful September afternoon, and B, the carrots actually tasted delicious. So it was like power of change through the palates of children using their lobbying power. And if that isn't a hopeful story, I don't know what is.
Love that. Love that. I'm going to jump forward. I've got a couple more questions for you, Patrick. So,
you wanted the Harmony Project as well?
I did. If we could.
Interestingly, that carrot story is part of a bigger project called the Harmony Project, which is to find a way to help teachers make sense of the existing curriculum and then show children through experiences of nature, like being in a carrot field, that actually they can make sense of the world in which they find themselves, and often they find quite confusing these days, by having a better relationship with nature. And the Harmony Project is another charity linked to the Sustainable Food Trust, which is focusing on education. And they have produced a teacher's manual for primary school teachers, which is now in 8 languages, including Welsh, of course, but also Ukrainian, Japanese, Chinese, which shows how any primary school, or whatever it's called in that country, can show how they can educate their children within the existing curriculum and show how everything is really connected and the same laws and principles of nature are in all things, and they can link that to what they're learning in the schools. And that's been an incredibly successful project, and I think we can scale it.
Yeah. Okay. Slightly different topic. At UK for Nature, we are running a campaign which we're calling Not So Fresh Water, where we're looking at essentially agricultural pollution in our freshwater ecosystems. So agricultural waste plays a big part in damaging our freshwater ecosystems. But if we talk about, I know you mentioned fertilizers and nitrogen fertilizers, but if we look at more chemical-based products, these can be a godsend for farmers. So can you talk us through what are some of the harmful chemicals commonly used in UK farming and what impact they're having on our ecosystems, and then maybe how we can change that common practice?
Yeah. I think if you look at what's happened to the rivers of the UK, especially England and Wales, it is a terrible story. I mean, the river this farm hills is part of the catchment of is the Avon, which is a river which is 26 miles long and starts in a beautiful spring-fed lake about 8 miles north of here, and then goes out to Bwlchwernen.
Mm-hmm.
And we did a river walk a couple of years ago, river pilgrimage. And over 2 days, we walked the entire course of the river from the source to the mouth. It was wonderful. We went to 5 churches on the walk. And we went, when the churches were open, we went and sang in them. It was the most amazing experience. But what was depressing about it was that quite soon after the source, the river didn't look right. And it started, I think, with septic tanks, because let's be honest, if it was just poo and wee that went into people's septic tanks, it would be fine. But the stuff that we are, flushing down the loo these days includes an awful lot of chemicals and drugs and God knows what, which really you wouldn't really want in a river system. But then it gets much worse than that. Of course, everyone knows about sewage, Thames Water Programme, all that kind of thing. So the sewage works are being overwhelmed by heavy rainfall, which is part of climate change. But the real core culprit, in my view, about 60% of the damage is being caused by agriculture. And the intensification of farming has had devastating consequences on rivers. And we have a holding called Hafod, which is Welsh name for summer grazing or summer place, which is about halfway down the Arun. And we've been grazing it now for 45 years. And the year before last, for the very first year, 43 years that we've been grazing it, there was no life in the river. No salmon. There used to be salmon and sea trout, but not even sticklebacks and fry. It just gone. And I think that the cause of that is a combination of slurry from intensive dairy farms and runoff from fertilizer, which farmers are using on their land. Again, don't blame the farmers, they're just part of a system. And that intensification of farming in this part of the world, dairy farming, but in further east, it's just arable farming, where the amount of pesticides and the fertilizers are put on the land, it just can't cope with it. And so it ends up, say, killing the Wye or all the other rivers. So really, if we want to restore the life of the river systems of the UK, we need to change agriculture. It's not, we just can't treat the symptoms. We have to treat the cause, which is over-intensive agriculture and chemically based agriculture. Of course, we need to do other things like sort the sewage out and be more responsible in what we put down the loo. But that's another point.
Yeah.
I think the primary thing is to change farming. And I think that your network can be leaders in that, because you are change makers and you're going to, hopefully, well, some of you already do, but I think you're going to occupy the seats of power in the future. And if you could use your knowledge of these things to start to be agents of change, I think that would be fantastic.
So how can we tackle this issue while still supporting farmers? Do you think it's in policy that the change will happen?
Yes, I do. So to give you an example, the Welsh government declared the whole of Wales as an NVZ, or they're aspiring to make the whole of Wales an NVZ, a nitrate vulnerable zone. And actually, that's a brilliant policy. And I'll summarize it very simply. If you imagine an acre of land or a hectare of land, and it has a certain amount of nitrogen going onto it, and that would be a combination of the fertilizer used, the animal feed, and the animals themselves that, are grazing the land. Now, if you limit the maximum amount of nitrogen equivalent that can go onto that acre of land or hectare of land, and they have done that, they've set a target of 180 kilograms of nitrogen equivalent per hectare. You obviously have to work that out. It's like add the muck, the poo, the fertilizer, and the animal feed, then do the algorithm and you work it out. And on this one, we're probably well inside that, because we're basically not buying a lot of external inputs. No fertilizer, no nitrogen fertilizer for 52 years, no pesticides. Our aim is to farm within the natural capacity of this hill to generate food. And that would mean that we were well inside the NVZ limit. But a lot of the intensive farmers, dairy farmers, are way outside it. But because Natural Resources Wales, which is the policing agency for Wales, are hopelessly understaffed and underfinanced, they can't police this. And then not only that, but the farming unions, the NFU and the FUW, they're going to the Welsh government saying, you're punishing us, we're very efficient farmers, you need to do what's called a derogation, which is put off the inevitable so that they can continue to pollute. And you could say you can't blame them for that, but actually they're just perpetuating disastrous policy. So I think we, whoever it is in positions of influence, we can start to make this a public issue. But in order to do that, you need to understand quite a lot. And I think that's the point about your being here, that this is not simple stuff, is it? It's quite nuanced. And it's very easy if you're an environmentalist to say this is terrible, but you actually need to have a good argument to go against these people who are quite clever, and they're worried because they probably, some of these intensive dairy farms, they borrowed millions to invest in all the kit and the equipment and the intensification. So you're up against literally a financial vested interest. It's not, again, they've been led by the wrong policy, but we need to be honest about this. We've got to stop this, otherwise we'll have dead rivers for the whole of England and Wales, and that's more or less what we've got today.
Last question. Looking ahead in, let's say, 50 years, if we are successful in making the change, what do you think farming and food consumption might look like?
I think we have to co-create a future where we are farming in harmony with nature. We are producing healthy food, which reduces NHS treatment costs. We're farming in such a way that the nature that we've lost can coexist with the food production system. And the nutrient density of the food is so great that we're going to be full of vital health. And I believe we can do that, but we will only do it if we scale the number of citizens who understand these issues and then use their buying power and their voting power to bring about the change that's needed. But yes, we can.
Amazing. Thanks, Patrick. And can I just say, on all of our behalves, it's been such an eye-opening weekend. So good to see a system like yours. I personally think this conversation around nature and farming is the most important thing happening right now, way more important than any RSPB, nature reserve or anything like that. This is the conversation to be having.
I think I would like to say just one other thing. I'd like to say this, because the thing is, through no fault of anyone, we've separated nature from food. We've separated it in terms of policy. We've separated it in terms of stories, and we've separated it in the imagination of children now. So if you ask somebody, what about biodiversity? They might talk about stewardship or rewilding or the last bits of nature that we're preserving by stopping agriculture. Well, I remember when you didn't need to do that, where you could farm in harmony with nature, producing food, and the nature could coexist in the field with food production, not just around the edges. So I think right at the core of this is a separation of this story of nature and food and people being one interconnected whole. That's what we need to bring back.
Thanks, Patrick.